Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another episode. I'm very excited to have Jim McMurtry back on the show. I've had him for a podcast and we had a great discussion. Jim is a history teacher, was a history teacher that was let go. And he knows a lot about the critical race theory that is being taught in the school and everything that pertains to it. Jim, thank you so much for coming back. And I hear that you've been doing quite a bit of stuff over there in your region since you've been let go.
Oh, it's great to be back with you, David. I don't know if I've done much. My employer has done something. It canned me like tuna. So about 3 months ago now, I have been out of work. And so it's hard. And the stand that I'm taking is what got me fired in the first place. And I just think that there's so much that's perverse and just clearly anti-educational happening in our schools. So I'm happy at an advanced age for a teacher, 64. I'm happy to, I'm a little less threatened by than younger teachers would be. So I'm happy to do this, and I'm not compromising in any way. I'm standing on principle, and I don't think there are many in the educational world who are doing that.
Absolutely. What did you find since you've started speaking out and you said that you've been let go? Have other teachers or educators reached out to you? I know on social media, people seem to have supported you in what you're saying. Tell me a little bit about these experiences.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm happy to. You can see in the background, there's a cuckoo clock. So I'm sure there's some people, maybe there's some symbolism there. Maybe people think that about me. But I just think my story, I was a teacher for a long time in the Surrey School District, and I didn't have any disciplinary problem and discipline, and quite the opposite. And I always felt that I had and I'm sure other teachers feel this as well, just a talent for teaching. And as I've gotten older and really know my subject matter, I feel that I'm good. And so it's sort of strange I find myself in this position. But what's happening in schools, and it predates my moving into the Abbotsford School District from Surrey, and I think it's a problem that's endemic everywhere in the Western world, just becoming really hard to teach. So for a long time, I just quietly, bore that cross that so many teachers have to, and I kept my mouth shut. I complained to colleagues and complained in quiet circles. It was only after that I was being threatened with dismissal that I decided to be more public about it. And I think I've been very public and very bold, and I appreciate the fact that you liked some of the stuff that I've been particularly active on Twitter. And you said to me before this broadcast that you liked the fact that I did a land acknowledgement in which I said, I acknowledge nothing. And that's how I feel. I'm just completely committed to the cause of doing what's right for children in schools. And there's 6 areas that if I could just quickly say them, that are a tremendous concern for me. And one is gender, and I know that's a concern for you. We can talk about any of this. And then there's race. Then for me as well, all the indigenization, the land acknowledgements, I find very threatening. And then the weakening of standards. Discipline for kids is not what it used to be. I think to some extent kids and parents are running the schools and not the teachers. And that's difficult for costume teachers to manage. All the kids everybody passing. There's nobody having to do homework. And there's just lots of trends in education that are worrisome for me. 2 other things. One is censorship of literature. So they're bringing in graphic sexual content in the form of, out in BC we call it soji, but it's I think it's Alberta as well. But anyhow, the radical gender theory that's everywhere in the Western world, and I just think it's particularly inappropriate for young kids, even just to be talking about things they're not ready for. So it's not that we can't have conversations about these things. It's just there's a time and a place. And I think it's particularly outrageous that it's taking the place of regular instruction. All the, memorizing different colors on a pride flag, or all these dozens of pronouns, and it just takes us away from what I think is essential. And I, as a parent, is essential, and that is our kids prepared for all the challenges ahead, both academically and socially, and many others, physically, morally. There's just so many challenges ahead to be wasting your time with this social justice, this woke drivel, which is to me communistic and nonsensical. So this idea they're judging kids on the basis of their color, and they haven't. Nobody's explained to me, what do you do with a kid who's half and half? So
That's right.
or if you're a spec indigenous, or you're a spec black or whatever, then everybody has to use indigenous black. And I don't think the kid wants to see him or herself in that regard. And it's just so. It's just anyhow. The whole thing is just made up by, I think, lunatics. I really have come to no other conclusion than that. And then the very last thing of the 6 things I wanted to mention to you is after the censorship of literature, really quality good stuff. And I understand the argument to some extent that you're worried about kids being harmed, being made uncomfortable. But when people say that a book like To Kill a Mockingbird, which is anti-racist and is profoundly moving, as any literary work can be, is being removed because someone's worried about one word in it. I think they're not understanding what literature is. And if we go through literature and try and find something that's going to upset somebody, there'd be no literature left. The last thing is what they're doing to history, and that pertains mostly to my case. Of all of them, this is the one that's most pertinent, that they're lying to kids about all sorts of things about history. They're smearing Canada. They're making my ancestors and everybody else's ancestors into beasts. And that's just not true at all. And what got me fired was suggesting one day in class that children who died tragically in residential schools, while enrolled at residential schools, did so mostly from disease such as tuberculosis. That's all I said, an innocuous comment. And since saying that 2 years ago, I haven't taught since, and likely will never teach again because I've been blacklisted for saying something that's established. Right out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, which itself is suspect in some ways, but certainly is something is held up by the political left as biblical. It was the final word on what happened in residential schools. Well, there's no talk of missing or murdered children in the Truth and Reconciliation report. So this is just all fiction that being created by people like Trudeau, who likes to dance atop the world stage as the savior, the number one virtual signal. Look at me, I'm going to help all these different people, and I'm going to do it by condemning white people. Well, great, thanks, Trudeau.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I'm not really sure what the end game of this is. I mean, it looks really bad on Canada, what they're doing as well, and it's all nonsense too. And one of the things in terms of critical race, I know you made it into 6 things, but I think as a result of critical race, I would say I would put some of those together, which is a critical race, and that falls with the indigenous in my mind because it's all kind of racialized subjects, and also the lowering of academics because that equity. I'm not sure how you feel about it. The way that I understand it is basically the message that schools are sending is kids that are different shade of skin are not apparently smart enough like other people, and thus we must lower the academics so we can achieve an equitable outcome, which is everybody passes. And obviously it's not doing anybody any favors because the kids who study a lot, they're not getting anything extra. As a matter of fact, they're probably getting bored in class. And the kids who don't study at all have no incentive to put any more effort in because they're going to pass just the same. So what do you think? What do you think is happening over there with the lowering of academics?
Well, I really appreciate what you're saying, in part because I'm a teacher. So I can make comments as I do about all sorts of movements in our society, such as this wokeism or wokeness. But my only area of authority would be, after over 40 years in the classroom as a teacher, is that. And I don't think it's this. None of this is good for kids in schools. So just two things in particular I'd like to say in response to that. The first thing, the standards are being lowered. It's just so ridiculous that all these administrators and people higher up on the board who pay themselves ever more money, they like to say, oh, look what we're doing for Black kids or Indigenous kids. More of them are passing or getting A's and graduating and getting into these programs and getting these scholarships. And it's just all, to me, just so unjust, because the scholarships aren't going to the most deserving kids. Kids aren't passing because they deserve to pass. It's just everybody. You just need to be an organism that is this breathing, and they'll get you through high school these days. And I don't think that helps those kids. But so you're absolutely right. Standards are going down because we want this equitable end. And I think the goal is woke communism. They're trying again to have everybody and every group end up in the same place. They're not killing the kulaks as they did during the early years of the Soviet Revolution to give to the less well-off farmers. But they might as well, they're doing something similar. They're taking away opportunities from Asian and white and other kids who are more deserving because they've done the work and they've achieved the standard to people who are less deserving. And so there's just, you're absolutely right on that. A lot of people call it the bigotry of low expectations, or lower expectations for people on the basis of skin color, which is just so absurd. I believe in everybody. And so the second thing I want to say, really, to address what you said very quickly is, and this is originally from Jordan Peterson, but many people have thought this. There's so many different categories that people could put any one of us. So you can look at me as an old, straight, white guy. But you can see me in many different ways. You can see me as right-handed. You can see me as light-haired. You can see me as tall, short, whatever you want to see me as. You can see me in the categories. If you want to look at a group that's discriminated against in schools, it's the kids that aren't intelligent, who aren't through inheritance, who are not gifted, who struggle at doing all sorts of things. So just so, I hate to, and I don't mean to in any way to demean, to denigrate any child, but there are children who have a hard time doing things. I've done a lot of French teaching. There are just some kids that can't do it. They can't learn the basic structure of French, and you see that right away with them. And that doesn't mean that they couldn't maybe over a long period of time, but it doesn't really work when you're moving with a group of 30 kids from point A to point B. Some kids just can't do it easily. And those kids are mocked. They're mocked by their classmates. They're mocked by they're punished by their parents. They're maybe to some extent, they're obviously feeling that they're put down by their teachers. And anyhow, try being an unintelligent child. So if people want to say, oh, there's oppression, there's discrimination, and there's, inequity in the school system, try being one of these two things. Try being an unintelligent child, or try being an unattractive child. Someone who's very much overweight, or way too thin, or way too pimply, or way too, the nose isn't perfect, the ears stick out too much. I remember when I was a kid in elementary school, this goes back a long time, but there's a girl in my class who missed a long time, and I found out, and then she came to school with a cast on her head. And I didn't really understand what it was. And someone said that she was always worried about her ears. She had ears that stuck out quite a bit. So she went through it in elementary school. She went through a procedure of getting her ears made more normal. Not that my ears are normal, but I mean, pinned back. So kids are very self-conscious about how they look and how intelligent they are, how quickly they learn relative to others. Nobody even pays any attention to that. For some reason, people are all obsessed with race and gender. Well, why don't you look at all those other categories out there? Why don't you look at the kids who are really discriminated against? And of course, I get out of third category. And this is where we're forgetting about this. Try coming from a home where there's no love. Try coming from a home where there's no food in the fridge. Coming from a home where there's a lot of fighting. Like, there's so many things that kids deal with. This idea that a black kid who's attractive and smart and 1,000 other things with a wonderful family and wonderful opportunities is oppressed. And some white kid who lives with his mother who's strung out in drugs and doesn't know his father and lives in a trailer park and scrounges for food and begs at school from classmates. Like, it's just so wrong to be putting kids in categories that are not only is it wrong to put them in categories, but they're putting them in false categories.
Yeah, that's right. I think the extent of their oppression is really a lot based on things like looks. Seriously, just the color of the skin, your sex, and all that stuff. And I think there's nothing wrong with having different academic levels. I know when I was in school, we had different academic levels in school, especially this was in high school, where you have academics and applied. I believe it was called applied was the easier courses, and the academic one was the higher courses. And I think that was good because the people who excel more should be able to be given that opportunity to learn more, and the people who need to catch up a little bit or maybe don't know that much should also be given that opportunity to learn at their pace, rather than stick everybody into a single pace line and make sure that everybody works the same over there. And right now, I think in schools, I'm not sure if it's the case over there, I think they got rid of all of that and everybody is all at the same low level, essentially. And I've really been thinking about this woke communism that you've discussed. I've just finished reading Animal Farm by George Orwell, and I'm currently on 1984 by George Orwell. So in Animal Farm, the dream, the utopia was pretty simple, get rid of the humans, and the pigs ended up taking over. And the pigs ended up saying, we need these accommodations, we need the money because we're the ones who are planning all of this. And the pigs ended up just working everybody else and becoming just like the humans in the end, which was oppressing everybody. And I find the same thing right now. The people on top, they're very much high paid people, and they like to play the victim card. We have a director of education over here at the Waterloo District School Board. He put out these videos for mental health, and he used this opportunity, this mental health day, to go on about how he was once homeless. And this guy has 3 degrees, says he comes from a good family, and has a lifetime of employment. And I don't even know where his homeless story came up, but I can tell you the only thing he's got in common with the homeless is the victim mentality and that he just can't get out of it. But he's the most privileged person over there, making the most money, and he just tries to be relatable, and it's such a bad look. And I'm seeing the same thing, like these people, they make it all the way up to the top and they're saying, oh, you can do it too, guys. You can do it too. Just pay us more. We'll hire more equity officers. We'll hire more people to enforce these rules upon you. It's just crazy.
Yeah, I just want 2 quick things. One is the whole zero-sum thing. Every time you give a scholarship or give an opportunity or you give a job to an Indigenous child or a Black child or whatever group people assume now are less capable, which is self-insulting, you're taking away from somebody else. And so this idea that you're doing something good for some, well, maybe you are, but you're doing something bad for others. If you have an Asian kid who is 95%, that child should have a better chance of getting into law school than an Indigenous kid who doesn't have to write the LSAT, doesn't have to get a grade average, doesn't have to get a degree first. Like, it's just, the whole thing is just so absurd. That's the University of Victoria Law School, by the way, where they, you don't, the indigenous applicants don't have to compete. They just don't worry about anything. So this is all over the place. Yes, the main point you just made, and this is the second thing you just say in response, is they talk about equity. And it's the people at the top talking about equity. And every year they manage to pay themselves. They get, the superintendent of a school district gets money from the government. And it's up to him or her to disperse the money. Well, it's surprising how much goes to the people at the top. I'm not going to call them pigs, but that the metaphor obviously is in 1984 or the allusion that we're making right now is to Animal Farm. So what the assumption there is, if you get rid of humans, the human farmers, then they're going to be having this blissful, post-capitalist society where everybody's equal and getting along beautifully. Well, as you know, it turns into a dystopia. It turns into a nightmarish type place where you just get a new group of people ruling and who are more brutal than the people before. That's how I find these equity people that manage to get up to the position of superintendent, that they're completely unconscious of how much they're taking, how much they themselves are eating at the trough, how they give themselves, for some reason, they don't have to pay into their pension. They don't have to pay for their car or their gas or their meals. They get all these things in addition to a huge salary. And then you have to, as a teacher, administrator, sit and listen to the people at the top of the district talk on about how important equity is. They're the biggest frauds out there in our society. The people, it's not just in schools, or school districts or boards, it's right across institutions. The most insincere, deceitful people in our society are the people at the top. It's like Trudeau saying that he's Mr. Anti-Racist. And I don't remember anybody walking around on numerous occasions, not so long ago, because he was a fairly young guy compared to many of us, wearing blackface or brown face. Like he just loved to dress up. So it's just, so he's not the best example. And then he presents himself as this great feminist. And he's just far from a great feminist in so many ways. He's particularly quiet about any horrible treatment of women outside of Canada, because it might go against his multiculturalism, because he's really after votes in multicultural communities. So he doesn't give a darn about women outside of Canada. And then, and just in another area, just to say about Trudeau and people like him, because I think many of these superintendents or people high up in school districts are carbon copies. And that is to do with the environment. That Trudeau pretends he's this great environmentalist. And where I live in Surrey, there's a train that goes right close to my house. And it's an open train full of coal. And you see it every day. And what it is, it's coal that's dug in Wyoming. But the American states, on the in the western part of the U.S., like Wyoming, they want to ship their coal to China, but the California, Oregon, and Washington don't allow that. They don't allow it for environmental reasons. So what they do from Wyoming in particular is they take the no containers on these train cars. They bring it through Vancouver. They bring it right by my house. So all the time you just see this a ton of coal being taken to China, and I go, wow, they're killing pipelines, which is a fairly inefficient and environmentally friendly way of transporting something, which is becoming increasingly environmentally friendly in Canada, the way with natural gas and so forth, relative to coal. So he pretends he's something that he's not. If he really cared, then he'd do something about these incessant coal trains passing by my house. But that's the way it is at the top. Parents, I think, are just too darn quiet coming back to schools about what's going on. There were 2 drag shows recently in schools where I live in Surrey, and I went to both of them. I couldn't get into the school answer, but I went and I talked to parents and so forth. Nobody knew about them. It was something happened at the school. It was quietly advertised. It took place so they can go, look at us. We have drag queens reading stories to our students. But it's quite interesting how they don't really want people to know about it. So just another contradiction. If you really are proud of the fact that last week in Surrey, there was Pride Week for all schools and all these things happening. Kids were learning pronouns and memorizing, as I said, the different parts of the flag and all sorts of other things that I think are really questionable, particularly when having kids thinking all the time that maybe they're in the wrong body and that maybe they should consider other ways of sexually expressing themselves. And of course, the kid could be 5. And so it's just really funny for me because if they really did care about Pride Week last week in Surrey, then why don't you put it on your school sign? Why don't you put it in a newsletter to parents? Why don't you be upfront about it? But they don't do that. They know what they're doing is wrong. These people are they're just base indoctrinators.
That's right. Yeah. And, you know, speaking about Pride, we've got an entire Pride month coming up, and I'm sure they're going to be ramping everything up. And even leading up to Pride month, you get days like the day against homophobia and transphobia and all the phobias, right? And it's basically a day where if you have a different opinion, right, you're really being labeled as hateful.
Yeah.
So as we mentioned near the beginning, Jim, you did a tweet where you said you acknowledge nothing in terms of the land acknowledgement. I don't think a lot of people know about this land acknowledgement and why it's not good. Can you give a little bit more information about the land acknowledgement, where it comes from, and kind of what it aims to do and why it should be avoided?
Yeah, and I'm honored. Again, I'm honored to be with you, Dave. You're such a nice person, and you ask great questions, and you're so respectful of your guests. And because this means something to me. So as I said, I've lost my livelihood for taking the stand that I have. But I think it's worth something. I think land acknowledgements, people are always trying to run something up a flagpole. When I was a young teacher, someone said, get rid of all the classroom walls and just have one big building so nobody is separate from anyone else. And of course, it couldn't function, so they built back walls. Throw out all the spellers. They did that. They throw out every speller because we whole language approach to education, to learning how to read. So they just come up with dumb idea yearly, or more than that. So anyhow, I could talk for a long time about why they do that, but it's mostly about just self-promotion. Look at me, I've got to create something. I'm sitting here having nothing to do as working in a board office, and I'm gonna, in between reading, drinking coffee and chatting with somebody or reading the newspaper, I got to think of something to justify my very big salary. So I'll come up with something, and all the teachers. So if someone came up tomorrow with the idea, some person in the board office said, teachers would be more effective if they taught standing on their head, spitting nickels. There'd be a ton of teachers that would be doing that moment because they go, I'll get promoted. I'll please people. I'll get a better assignment next year. Like, the reality is people in all professions want to get ahead, want to hold on to what they have. And so it's scary to swim against the mainstream. And so we've got land acknowledgements. For whatever reason, we got these land acknowledgements. They're very upsetting. They're an assault on property rights. That's a fundamental right of Canadians and people around the world. You have a right to what you yourself have legal title to. I worked hard to buy the home that I'm in, and I don't want anyone taking it away. So when they talk about we're on stolen land, that's threatening to many people, particularly immigrant people who are escaping countries where everything can be taken away from them. So they don't want to hear that here in Canada. It's also just a waste of school time. It's every single day. It's like the Chinese, water drop torture or whatever. It's not, nobody can question it. It's nonsensical. And they also add, stuff like, genocide and all that. So I was contacted, 8 months ago or 7 months ago by someone from Rebel News and a reporter. And she said to me, Drea Humphreys, she said to me, Jim, will you do an interview with me on land acknowledgements? And I said, well, I'd like to do an interview on why I'm being fired and the falsification of history. That's why I'm in big trouble here. So I'm not really fighting land acknowledgements. So don't you have somebody else? And she said, no. She couldn't find a teacher at anywhere in Canada. Rebel News couldn't find a teacher who would be willing to speak out against land acknowledgements. There's no teacher. There's no kid in school there's no parent that I know of going every day in school, before you do anything else, stop what you're doing and do the same land acknowledgement as the day before, and say a lot of other stuff like, we committed genocide and we continue to commit genocide against Indigenous people, who of course get billions of dollars every year that other groups don't get. And so the whole thing to me is it's no better than, you talked earlier about 1984, about what Big Brother requires of people in that dystopian society. It's like a 2-minute hate session, which is 1984. And that's what we're doing. 2 minutes, let's hate all our white ancestors and throw in colonization as though there's something wrong with going and living in a place. Like as if Aboriginal people didn't go and live in North America. Of course they did. They moved and they conquered and they took other people's land, and that's human history. So it seems to me that I'm the only teacher anywhere that's smart enough, courageous enough, or dumb enough and whatever enough to take a public stand to say that as well. People say, oh, it's going to hurt my case. It's going to hurt this, that. I don't care. And that's how I'm approaching this. And I'm not alone. There are other people there, but they're not teachers that I'm doing it. There's so many things that I detailed at the beginning of this interview that are wrong that are happening in schools. When you yourself are talking about standards going down, kids, it's just absolutely absurd that we in 2023 are doing a less good job at preparing kids for the future than we were doing 5 years ago or 10 years ago. We know more all the time. We have better resources all the time. We should be doing a better job all the time in schools. And now it's not that. Now they're going to be happy if nobody learns anything, but everybody's equal in the end. All groups. Look, Black kids and Indigenous kids learn nothing, but same with white and Asian kids. They learn nothing too. Kids from rich,
I suppose we're all equal in that respect. Nobody knows anything.
Rich kids didn't learn anything, and neither did poor kids. So we're success. Pay us even more money. Those of us who sit in jobs, unproductive jobs in board offices, pay us even more. So look, there's so many things, but you asked about land acknowledgements. I can't think of a single good thing about a land acknowledgement. I've never heard a kid or a teacher ever say a single good thing about land acknowledgements. And nobody can question it, because when I talked about woke communism, part of communism was you can't take wealth from those who have it without violence, without there's some resistance. You can't take scholarships and marks and opportunities, and whether getting into university programs or getting jobs away from certain people in our society, them getting mad about it. So there's an awful lot there's a lot of new anger in our society that's being created, starting in our schools. And I just, and that's what I'm thinking. I'm feeling that. I'm just someone who's just so fed up with what school authorities are getting away with, when they had a pretty good thing not so long ago. What I experienced in school was never perfect, but I thought it was really good. And I love the books that I read, and to see that they're all being removed to replace with social justice literature, where they talk about masturbation, cunnilingus. I'm not sure you can even have some of these words on, but they're telling kids about deviant sexual practices, about, stopping their puberty and cutting off body parts. And it's just, anyhow.
It's crazy, and all of this stuff is like we've mentioned it before many times. It's all being taught right from kindergarten and up. And yeah, I think this thing with the land acknowledgement, I don't think many parents know that these students have to do it every single day, right? And it's like every day you're saying the same thing, and it's painting Canadians as these hateful people, when in fact, I think it's the opposite. I think the reason why we've got to this place is because we've been extremely tolerant, and now that tolerance is being used against people to tolerate intolerable behavior. It's just crazy. We've come full circle, and we're hiring I know at Waterloo District School Board, they hire based on the color of the skin and your gender and sex and all. Like, it's crazy, right? And we've come full circle. We went from trying to eradicate something to fully implementing it, and everybody's patting themselves on the back. So,
Can I
yeah,
respond to one thing there that you said? I just
yeah,
want to be accurate. And if there's anything I say to anyone, to you now or to anyone at any time, that's not accurate, I'd like to know about it. I'd like to be tested on it. And if I'm found wrong, then I will certainly, I will say mea culpa, I'm my bad, and I won't say that again. I just wanted to clarify one point. The school that I was working at, the school district that I was working at in Abbotsford, had land acknowledgements every day. I don't know that that's the case in every school and in every district in Canada. I know it's in most, but I just want to be really clear about that. And again, nobody has a choice about it. The moment a teacher, for example, the adult in the room, in the classroom, says anything to anyone, then it's a big problem. And so I don't know what happens when one gets promoted into becoming an administrator, that one all of a sudden starts wearing the mantle of a fascist, where all of a sudden you go from being a nice, normal, tolerant teacher who gets along with colleagues to somebody who's going, we're not going to talk about that. You can't question that. That's board policy. And they look at you like you've committed the worst heresy imaginable. And yet teachers, in my view, should be motivated by what's best. And a lot of what we do in the classroom from day to day doesn't work well. So I think it's important that we're always talking with each other and trying to figure out, hey, what's the best way that you teach long division? Because I'm not having success or French verbs because I'm having a hard time with my class. But it's not that. They're really closing down discussion. So this is another thing that's just really, when you talk about education is root sense. We mentioned the last time I interviewed was this leading out and developing. How can you do that when you can't talk about all sorts of subjects? How can you do that when you start labeling kids? And then when you talk, David, about people being hired on that basis, my whole career, I did a PhD at the University of Toronto, and when I started applying for jobs, I was told, sorry, we're not hiring men. So I had to deal with that for a period of time. And then, of course, I just long since gave up because I'm too old, I'm white, I'm straight. And that's not what they're looking for. They're trying to create this equitable, meaning equity is this lovely word which means unfair. It used to mean fair. That they're the words that are really big. I call it DIE, diversity, inclusion, equity. They're not what they mean. If they cared about diversity, they would have diverse viewpoints. If they cared about inclusion, they would hire straight white older males like me. If they cared about equity, then they would be fair. And they're not being fair. And they're making education just something that is really undesirable in so many different ways.
yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a very big problem. It's become a very big problem. One of the things that I was wondering, I don't know how much you know about this, and I haven't said too much because I don't know how accurate it is. When it comes to a subject, even like mathematics, from what I hear, they say that mathematics is rooted in white supremacy and all of this stuff. Is that just things on social media that people say, or are they actually trying to push that narrative in schools?
Well, I can tell you right now, the last conversation I had a teacher at my school, W.J. Mowat Secondary in Abbotsford, was with a math teacher. And he said to me, he rolled his eyes and he said, I support you. I've heard about your struggles in fighting this locus in schools. He said they're doing it to us as math teachers. They're saying that what we're doing is racist. So I've researched how is math racist? And they have no argument. They have no, of course, they don't have any argument in any of this. But what they say is that math comes to us from, this is what we did in the Western world. This is what the Greeks and the Romans. I think our greatest influence for us was really Arabs, and for both our language and for our numeracy. We got our language mostly from the Phoenicians, if you had to think one group above others. And mathematics, a lot of people say India had an important influence on it, but it comes to theirs. Anyhow, but it came from all around the world. The oldest continuous civilization is the Chinese. So we owe so much to the Chinese. And then, of course, India, as already mentioned, but they gave us the zero and decimal point. Anyhow, there are all lots of things. So my point is this. I'm sorry, the concept of zero. But and there's no knowledge of anything in the world that hasn't been informed by people everywhere. It's like sitting down to an Italian pasta dinner and going, this is typically Italian. Well, no, you got to stop for a second and you think, well, really, is it? You know, the tomato sauce comes from the Americas. The Italians didn't have it before Columbus came over in 1492. So my point is everything is influenced all over the place. I think indigenous people have had tremendous influence in world knowledge, just like every other group, because they had knowledge of the flora and fauna here long before others did. And the most obvious was in dealing with the traveling sickness of sailors on these boats for months. They got scurvy. And it wasn't a problem for indigenous people because they knew that by boiling birch or spruce leaves, needles, that they could ward off this disease. So this idea that math was only Western is just idiocy. And the second thing is, even if it were, even if all our math comes only from England, let's just say, then what's wrong with that? It's still knowledge. It's still absolutely essential. If there's a better form of math, then it would have been replaced by now. Indigenous people didn't have numeracy. They didn't have literacy. They didn't have the wheel. They also didn't have numeracy, meaning that they didn't count from 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 or the number 357. They had one, they had several, and they had many. That's how they conceived of it. So they didn't have that. And they've been provided with that. People around the world have been provided with a very complex system of organizing our thought with regard to areas that we refer to as math and so forth. That can be a bad thing is crazy. David, I know that you support what I'm saying, but maybe you could tell me what could possibly be wrong. And so these people, what they're doing is, okay, so math is bad, and you're calling it Western, which is wrong. But let's say it is Western, and you're saying it's bad, so what are you going to replace it with? Guess what they've come up with? Guess what these woke wizards have come up with? Instead of going, if there's two trains and they're traveling at these speeds and they cross each other, they go, okay, if there's two canoes, and they're thinking, oh, gee, there's indigenization again. We have solved all the problems of the modern world by replacing a train with a canoe. Now, the problem with a canoe, of course, is many kids don't know what a canoe is, particularly new immigrants. But every kid knows what a train is. So you've accomplished nothing. You've made math worse, but you're patting yourself on the back because you are an anti or decolonizer. No, you're not. You're an idiot. That's how I feel about it.
I honestly, for the life of me, I cannot think of a single reason for them even putting this argument forward. Like you said, best case scenario, which I suppose is worst case scenario for them, that math is Western or whatever. It's like, okay, it doesn't matter because math doesn't really care what you think. Math is just math and it is what it is. And everybody can do it regardless of how you identify. It transcends all humanity and it will be there. And it was there before we came, and it will still exist after we came because it has nothing to do with us. It's math is math, and you just add it up or subtract, and that's
but it's rational. It's rational. The word rational comes from math, right? From ratio. So what you've got is this idea of making comparison and related to a point you said earlier, which I didn't have a chance to respond to. The idea that we were so terrible in Canada, and Canada still is this racist country, compared to where? So Canada isn't perfect. We have murders, we have imperfect schools, we have whatever it is. We have sexism, racism. Sure, we have these things, but less than anywhere else in the world. So they're forgetting the comparing too, and that's what math does. And that's, I love the word rational. Rational is this idea, it's something that's objective, something empirical, something that you can easily test and measure and see. The woke people hate that because nothing that they say makes any sense. It's like the big, right now, this is a 2-year anniversary of finding 215 murdered children in a mass grave in Kamloops, thinking that all these priests and nuns at that school killed that many kids just in one Indian residential school. So the flag went half mast for almost half a year, and we ended up with a holiday, September 30th, so we can cry about this and about how genocidal we are. All members of parliament voted on a motion saying that we committed genocide. So anyhow, it just goes on and on about how terrible we are. And then you stop and think and go, did they discover anything? No, they didn't discover anything. If they dig, they'll find a septic tank bed. That's all it's a neat row. It's just clearly septic. But, and of course they're pretending that didn't happen anymore. But it's down. You had over 60 churches vandalized or burned. You had the whole world talking about Canada being this disgusting place because we allowed in one school 215 children to be secretly abused, burned, hanged, all these things that were circulating about them, and then put in the ground and without putting a marker on it. None of it's true. And most people realize that right now, but they can't talk. The media is still staying away from it, except for the alternative media. And so this is what we live in. It doesn't, woke people don't like anything that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. My daughters came home. I talked to my oldest one. Just wanted to see if she knows anything about these indigenous issues. And I said, hey, what do you know about it? And she said, the kids were treated really bad at school and they were beat with hot red pans. I was like, what? And, like, I don't know. Sometimes I don't even know what to say. And yeah, I just had a conversation with her. I was like, okay, listen. So I just sat her down. Now, I don't know how many of these kids at school, whatever random things that they're being taught, just to elicit like an emotional reaction, right? I mean, it could be, you could say anything, right? And these kids were like, wow, that's really bad, right? And just to elicit this emotional reaction. And I'm seeing the fruits of these reactions. These kids, I stay off social media. I don't have it on my phone. I come and I post sometimes from the computer and then I'm off. But there's videos, obviously, that are more and more videos coming out of these kids who are basically activists. The school trains activists and they just chant the same thing and they're just emotional, nothing rational. Of course, we need both. I'm not saying it's bad to have emotions or whatever. We need both, but it's purely emotional, just anger, no ration, no thinking, and they're just causing havoc and chaos in the schools. And activists showing up, protesting parents and all of these things, like, it's crazy. I think this is the biggest thing with these stories that are made up. Then they're pushed through. They elicit this reaction, which is un-Canadian. It's against Canadian history and how inclusive we were. Like I said, I think we made it to this point because we were very tolerant. And now we're being pushed with the tolerance as Canadians. And I tell people, you gotta stop having this empathy and compassion, which is a good thing, being used against you to tolerate intolerable behavior. So
can I answer the red hot pen? I'm part of a research group. It's called the Indian Residential School Research Group, and it has many highly esteemed individuals as part of it. And I get daily communication from people talking about good things and bad things about the residential schools. Never heard that one. So I'll have to let others know that apparently they were doing that as well. The effect of that on kids is to assume that it's a simple matter these schools were bad. And it also has the effect on Indigenous children and Native kids in schools of them hating the rest of us. I don't think either effect is desirable. So why are we doing it? I think if we want to have an intelligent discussion on residential schools, we should wait, first of all, until the kids are older, because I don't think they don't know their continents. They don't know how to count to 100. They don't know all sorts of basic things. Some kids, I've met kids in high school who have difficulty reading, and I know they get special help and so forth, but there are kids who get into high school who can't read. Why are we talking about in grade 1 residential schools? So it's just all propaganda. But it's very clear from all the work that I've done in residential schools is that for most kids, it was a good experience. A good experience in that they came away from it better than when they went in, with an education and lots of other things. Now, there are things that were wrong about it, and this idea of kids being ripped from their families, that's just ridiculous, because it was 49 years after non-Indigenous kids had to go to school, or they'd be ripped from their, 49 years later. So my point is, if you're talking about compulsory education being bad, talk about it first with non-Indigenous kids, because they've suffered with it much longer. And then the residential schools were never forced upon anybody. It was something that people subscribed to. In some cases, there were waiting lists, and they're right up into the early 60s when most of the residential schools were being closed. People were protesting because they wanted them to stay open. Why don't you, if you say that there's some kids that had bad experiences, the residential schools, if they were abused, just say that and just say that that's wrong and horrible. But also say, by the way, that many of those kids that were abused by other students. Why don't you just say that? Or abused by Native caretakers or cooks or janitors at the school. Just be fair about it. Don't say all Christian teachers in the last century and century before that were monsters, because the first residential school began almost 200 years ago, the Mohawk College Institute in Brantford. So this has been a part of a legacy for a long time of freely offering education to people from Indigenous communities. To paint that as this, to have kids thinking about it as it was House of Horrors, they went there to be tortured, is unfair, and in my view is an abuse of of history. And then I say abuse of history because that's the title from Friedrich Nietzsche in one of his books or essays, is that people have always abused history because they're wanting to achieve something. So they're lying to kids about all sorts of things, but there's a reason for it. And it has everything to do with them looking good. They've got in it. Trudeau went into office thinking, what can I do to look better than everybody else? I'll pretend everybody else and all previous prime ministers were racist and mistreated Indigenous people, but I'm going to be different. No, aren't you wonderful, Trudeau? And if you want to be better with Indigenous people, then give them water and help them deal with suicide and parental dysfunction and all sorts of drugs, all these things that exist on Native reserves. Deal with those problems, but you're not. You're just focusing on you. You're just wearing a headdress and you're getting a teddy bear and taking a knee on a reserve in Saskatchewan where it was a community reserve, where it was a Catholic grave. You're just pretending. You're just you're just that drama teacher from long ago doing theatrics, thinking that this is actually any of this is true or real. It's not. He lives in a play world. And sadly, we're taking a generation of kids and we're abusing their notions of us and the people of our ancestors. I think that's just such a miscarriage of justice. And of course, the justice system is now just as bad because they're full with all these woke judges and adjudicators and just the beast and just on, and lawyers and on and on and on. And they're all part of the same game where it matters more. Oh, the person who killed, his wife is indigenous, therefore we shouldn't put him in jail, put him in a healing circle, and I'm back in the community a year later to murder another Native woman. Like, it doesn't help anybody to make special rules based on race or anything else. It's just you should treat people in a sensible, rational way.
Absolutely. I mean, that common sense is probably too sensible for these people. So well said, Jim. Before we wrap it up, I just wanted to know, is there anything that you wanted to say that you feel we haven't covered, maybe that the listeners or the viewers would benefit to hear?
Well, if I could just say one thing about myself, just when put this in or not, is that as I said earlier, I'm the only teacher taking a stand in a lot of these things. So I would love people to check out my Twitter, because you're getting something that's unadulterated. You're getting something that is not going to get from the CBC or the Globe and Mail or Toronto Star. You're getting something that is researched, that is happened, and that other people aren't willing to say. So I hope the people who are watching your show are going to, and it's not just me, there are other people who are doing that as well. But go on to Twitter, go on to, because that's the freest of the media sources that I'm aware of. And that's why I'm on Twitter, where people aren't censoring you all the time, and just make up their own minds, read my posts and make up their own mind if I'm right or wrong. But they should do themselves a service of knowing that there's an alternative narrative to what is being fed to them by government and media in Canada.
Absolutely. I'm going to be providing the link in the description as always. I do encourage all the viewers and listeners. I'm going to put the first podcast that we had together as well in the description. And this was fresh off when you were going through the firing process. And I think we had a great conversation then, and I'm very happy that we had a follow-up conversation now. And I hope more and more parents become aware. I do find that you post a lot of great information, and I just wanted to encourage you to keep it up. Seems like you are reaching people, and people are realizing and siding with you on this. Maybe it's just a circle of people that I'm in, but I mean, there's always trolls on the internet, but I'm finding a lot of common sense people in real life, just agreeing with common sense. And I just wanted to thank you, Jim, so much for all the effort that you put in and the spotlight that you're shining on this, and just the work that you're doing, advocating for children and protecting them, and hopefully we get to turn this ship around where we get to teach kids and not indoctrinate them.
Beautifully said, and thank you ever so much.
You're very welcome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you've made it this far into the show, I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us. All links are going to be in the description, and I'm sure this is not going to be the last conversation I'm going to be having with Jim. He's always up to something very good, something very positive, and I hope you like this episode and subscribe for more. Thank you.